Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was one of the most iconic and controversial leaders of the 20th century. His rise from a privileged upbringing in rural Cuba to becoming the bearded revolutionary who defied American imperialism is a tale steeped in charisma, ideology, and unwavering defiance. As the architect of the Cuban Revolution and the leader of the Republic of Cuba for nearly 5 decades, Castro reshaped the nation's political, economic, and social trajectory while playing a pivotal role in Cold War geopolitics. Whether hailed as a freedom fighter or condemned as a dictator, Castro's influence extended far beyond the shores of his island nation. His leadership inspired revolutionary movements across the globe, drew the ire of multiple US presidents, and turned Cuba into a symbol of both socialist resilience and repression. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in Biran, in Cuba's eastern Oriente province. His father, Ángel Castro, was a wealthy Spanish-born sugar plantation owner, and his mother, Lina Ruz González, was a domestic servant on the estate. Although born out of wedlock, Fidel was later recognized and received a privileged education, attending private Jesuit schools such as Colegio de Belén in Havana. He excelled academically and athletically, developing a reputation for fierce independence and oratory prowess. In 1945, Castro enrolled in the University of Havana to study law. It was during this period that he was radicalized. The university was a hotbed of political activism, and Castro gravitated toward anti-imperialist and nationalist causes. His early political engagements included opposing the US-backed dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and protesting against injustices in Colombia and Venezuela. These experiences, combined with an immersion in Marxist literature and Latin American nationalist thought, catalyzed his revolutionary ideology. Castro envisioned a Cuba free from foreign domination, economic inequality, and social injustice, a vision that would later shape the foundation of the Cuban Revolution. By the early 1950s, Cuba was under the control of Fulgencio Batista, a former army sergeant who had become a dominant political force. After serving as a populist president from 1940 to 1944, Batista returned to power through a military coup in 1952, cancelling elections and establishing an authoritarian regime heavily supported by US business interests and the mafia. Under Batista, Cuba became a playground for American capitalism and corruption, while the majority of Cubans languished in poverty. Castro, who had grown disillusioned with legal avenues for reform, turned to revolution. In July 1953, he led approximately 160 rebels in an assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The attack failed spectacularly. Most of the insurgents were killed or captured, but the event marked the beginning of Castro's transformation into a revolutionary icon. Castro was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he used his trial as a platform, delivering the now famous speech, "History will absolve me." In it, he laid out his 5 revolutionary laws which promised land reform, workers' rights, and political sovereignty. Due to growing public sympathy, he was released in a general amnesty in 1955. Exiled to Mexico, Fidel Castro regrouped and founded the 26th of July movement, named after the Moncada assault. There, he met Argentine Marxist Ernesto Che Guevara, whose revolutionary fervor and internationalist ideals perfectly aligned with Castro's vision. In December 1956, Castro and 81 other rebels, including Raúl Castro and Guevara, sailed back to Cuba aboard the yacht Granma. After a disastrous landing, only a handful of the group survived and retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there, Castro conducted a guerrilla war, rallying peasants, intellectuals, and disillusioned military defectors. By 1958, the movement had grown into a full-scale insurgency. Castro's use of propaganda, strategic alliances, and populist rhetoric won him increasing support, while Batista's brutal repression alienated the Cuban public. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and Castro's forces entered Havana in triumph. Although initially denying communist ambitions, Castro quickly moved to consolidate power. The revolution's early phase saw sweeping reforms. agrarian land redistribution, rent controls, nationalization of foreign businesses, and literacy campaigns. In 1961, Castro formally declared Cuba a socialist state and proclaimed his Marxist-Leninist orientation. The transformation was rapid and radical. Castro's government launched an ambitious literacy campaign, reducing illiteracy from over 20% to under 4% within a year. Free universal healthcare became a hallmark of Cuban society. The country developed a world-class medical system, and Cuban doctors became symbols of socialist solidarity abroad. All major industries were nationalized. The United States, whose businesses were affected, responded with an economic embargo that remains in place today. In 1965, the Communist Party of Cuba was established with Fidel as first secretary. Over time, all opposition was stifled, independent media banned, and dissent punished, turning Cuba into a single-party authoritarian state. Cuba's socialist pivot alarmed the United States. In 1961, the CIA orchestrated the Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The operation was a humiliating failure for the United States and a massive propaganda victory for Castro, solidifying his anti-imperialist image. The following year, the world faced its most dangerous nuclear confrontation. In October 1962, United States spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The resulting standoff between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Although the missiles were removed following a secret United States-Soviet deal, Castro was furious at being excluded from the negotiations. The crisis, however, cemented Cuba's role as a front-line state in the Cold War. Castro deepened ties with the Soviet Union, which provided economic aid, military support, and a market for Cuban sugar. Castro's Cuba became a hub for revolutionary activity across the globe. Unlike other socialist states, Cuba under Castro did not merely defend its own revolution, it sought to export it. In Africa, Cuban troops fought in Angola, Ethiopia, and the Congo, supporting Marxist movements and anti-colonial struggles. Castro's intervention in Angola in particular was decisive in securing the MPLA's victory and frustrating South African apartheid ambitions. In Latin America, the Cuban regime provided training, funding, and ideological guidance to guerrilla movements in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, and Bolivia, where Che Guevara was killed in 1967. Castro became a key leader in the non-aligned movement, seeking a third path between American capitalism and Soviet communism. He hosted the 1979 summit in Havana, giving voice to developing nations. Despite some achievements, Castro's economic model faced deep structural problems. Cuba was heavily dependent on Soviet subsidies, and when the USSR collapsed in 1991, it plunged Cuba into an economic catastrophe known as the Special Period. GDP fell by 35%, food and fuel became scarce, and power outages were common. In response, Castro implemented limited market reforms, allowing small-scale private businesses, opening Cuba to foreign tourism and investment, and permitting the use of US dollars. Though these changes were seen as pragmatic, Fidel remained ideologically rigid, insisting that socialism would not be abandoned. Cuba survived, but the crisis exposed the fragility of its planned economy. And in 2006, due to deteriorating health, Fidel temporarily handed power to his brother Raúl Castro, who officially became president in 2008. Though Raúl introduced more liberalizing reforms, including expanding the private sector and restoring diplomatic ties with the US under President Obama, Fidel remained an influential voice until his death on November 25, 2016. Fidel Castro's legacy is deeply contested. Some of his achievements include one of the world's highest literacy and healthcare standards, reduced racial inequality, and improved gender equality. And he asserted Cuban sovereignty and stood up to a global superpower for over 5 decades. Criticism of his policies include repression of civil liberties and political freedoms, thousands of political prisoners and exiled citizens, economic inefficiency and chronic shortages. Internationally, he is remembered as both a liberator and a despot. In Latin America, Africa, and parts of the global South, he remains a symbol of resistance and self-determination. In the United States and among Cuban exiles, he is seen as a tyrant who betrayed democratic ideals. Fidel Castro was a man of contradictions, an eloquent intellectual and ruthless authoritarian, a champion of the poor and a silencer of dissent, a global symbol of revolutionary defiance and the architect of a tightly controlled state. His life encapsulated the ideological tensions of the 20th century between socialism and capitalism, revolution and repression, sovereignty and superpower dominance. Love him or loathe him, Fidel Castro left an indelible mark on history. As he once predicted, history will absolve him, but only time will determine exactly how. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.